I am now joined by the director of UNICEF's private fundraising and partnerships division in Geneva, Carla Haddad Mardini. Welcome to Gamers Without Borders. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me. First of all, how are you?
I'm fine. Thank you for having me. Very excited to join you in this interview.
Well, I also believe congratulations are in order because your latest role at UNICEF began in January this year.
Exactly. So I joined this team in January 2021, and we're managing in the midst of this global emergency, this pandemic.
Well, most of our viewers are probably, for sure, familiar with UNICEF and your humanitarian mission. But for those of you who are joining us at the first time, first of all, welcome. Could you please tell us a little bit more about how UNICEF is changing the world?
So UNICEF is the leading organization for children, and we work in more than 190 countries and territories, and we cover two aspects: humanitarian emergencies, whether it's wars, armed conflicts, violence, or natural disaster, and we cover also situations of development, countries that are trying to rise above poverty and move into a better development situation for children. So we're present everywhere, before, during, and after emergencies.
Well, I want to specifically talk now about your role because how has private fundraising strategies changed during this year?
So it's been an impressive year. We have seen our partners from the private sector step up to support. I mean, think about it. This pandemic came in a time, in an unprecedented time, and has disrupted everything around us. We are 10 years away from the achievement that we want to have happen in terms of sustainable development goals. And we have 10 years, 9 years now to make it happen. This pandemic comes and we're seeing reversals everywhere. Everything going backward. How will we make sure that children stay in school, that they can learn, that their education is protected? The pandemic has disrupted everything. And one thing I wanted to share is that UNICEF is the leading organization in vaccines procurement and distribution around the world for children and in immunization. So we were called by the COVAX facility to support, because of our experience, and to be the ones leading on the distribution of vaccines and the supply of vaccines in many countries that are not wealthy, that do not have access. So we make sure there's vaccine equity. Everyone has access to vaccines and no child and no family is left behind. So it's been a massive, massive period for UNICEF. And not only did we have to manage the pandemic and this global emergency, we also needed to continue the regular work in countries like Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Colombia, and in countries where the needs are huge in Africa, Latin America. So the work has been ongoing. And on top of that, a massive, massive stepping up for the pandemic. So we make sure everyone has a chance to be vaccinated.
I think people tend to forget that the COVID pandemic has taken over, all news and media for so long that they forget everything else that's going on in the world as well, and everything that UNICEF is striving to do outside of the COVID pandemic on top of it. So, I mean, it's incredible work. But in 2020, Gamers Without Borders donated roughly $3.9 million to UNICEF. So can I ask you how that donation has helped your organization?
Oh my God, you cannot imagine. This donation was critical. Let me just share with you how we've used it. We've used 200 million surgical masks with this donation. We've procured 50 million gloves, 15 million N95 respirators, 2.7 million gowns, 2.8 million face shields, 1.1 million goggles, and 168,000 oxygen concentrators. When you see what's happening in India, your donation, however small or big, can make a huge difference, because we're racing against the clock to fight this pandemic. And we stabilize it somewhere and then it pops up somewhere else with new variants. So it is a race against the clock, and the support from your fans and your participants in Gamers Without Borders is an amazing contribution to our work. We're very grateful, very, very grateful.
Well, I mean, you are welcome. You might think as well, viewers at home, that the COVID-19 mostly means, all we need to do is provide testing and provide medical equipment as well. But there is a bigger picture there, right? So on top of the medical equipment and the testing, you also provide help on multiple levels. So just to list off a few, repairing and maintaining water pumps, providing solar power systems and lab equipment for medical centers in vulnerable countries. What was the biggest challenge UNICEF had to face in 2020?
Country readiness. It's not just about providing the vaccines. You need to transport the vaccines. There's the cold chain that needs to be preserved. You'll see many videos showing how the vaccines were being transported, sometimes on camels, sometimes on trucks, sometimes on motorcycles, bicycles. I mean, think about it. We're talking about countries where access is difficult logistically, where you have to go through forests, through difficult terrain. It's been a massive undertaking. The results speak for themselves, but it's a race against the clock. Let me also say that in terms of logistics and in terms of support, the private sector has been amazing. And we know that for such a huge emergency, no one can do it alone. Not one organization, not one government, not one entity. You need collaboration across the public sector, governments, the private sector, and multilateral agencies who have presence on the ground, who can monitor how the distributions are taking place, where are the stumbling blocks, the weaknesses, how can we improve. So country readiness was critical. And one thing we really focus on at UNICEF is strengthening health systems. I mean, when we see what's happening in some countries, health systems are collapsing. You can see it in Lebanon, you can see it in India. The pressure on the health system is huge. And so that is a critical priority for UNICEF. And that's how we try to make sure we're leveraging the right level of funds and support so that we can maintain the continuity of our response in the field.
Well, UNICEF's focal point is children, as you've already mentioned before, and we've touched on the fact that 300 million children have been educated with distance learning through UNICEF. Could you please touch on that a little bit more?
Yes, this has been impressive. We've always talked about distance, remote learning, distance learning. Not everyone has access to the internet. And one of the huge priorities for UNICEF is connecting every school in the world to the internet. Easier said than done, but we have a lot of work being put into that. I want to speak to you also about an example that scaled in Ukraine. We had a collaboration with Microsoft, and we've produced what we call the Learning Passport. And Ukraine was one of the first countries to roll out its entire curriculum online. So a digital platform, Learning Passport, which allowed continuation and no disruption of the learning of children. One thing also for our audience, and you're all young and you're studying and most of you are in schools, think about those children who, when they're extracted from school, cannot come back. I'm speaking about girls in Africa, in Asia. The minute they're out of school, it's much harder to bring them back. And the longer they're out of school, the harder it is. We have issues of early marriage and, work. So we need to make sure children are back in school. The second thing is the quality of learning. Being in school is not enough in itself. You need quality learning. And today in UNICEF, we talk of the learning poverty. And this is terrible. I mean, we are 10 years before the achievement of the SDGs, and we want to reach the Sustainable Development Goals. And children are critical. They're the future generation of leaders, of CEOs, of teachers. And we cannot afford to leave any child behind. So even if the virus did not impact children directly in the sense that you had less loss of life in children than in adults or the elderly, the impacts, the indirect impacts on children were massive. School disruption, mental health issues, seeing their parents losing their jobs. I mean, the impacts were massive. We cannot afford not to look at children as the priority group, and to make sure we're really scaling digital learning, making it possible to be offline and online seamlessly. And that is a top priority. And your support will help us continue doing that across the board.
Well, we've talked quite a fair amount about 2020, so let's try and look to the future now. We're deeply moved and honoured that you've chosen Gamers Without Borders as a platform for UNICEF this year. What are your goals for 2021, the remainder of this year?
So this year, it's really vaccination. We cannot afford not to have people vaccinated. And the problem is you have infodemics, you have communications that are disturbing. And so your role is to help us message properly around vaccines and convince people that vaccines are safe, and that as long as not everyone is vaccinated, it's very difficult to control this virus. So your role on social media platforms to help us communicate properly around vaccinations and vaccine equity is essential. We cannot afford to have only the wealthy countries covered with vaccines and poorer countries or low-income, middle-income countries not having access. So vaccine equity will be essential. So for us, the first priority this year is continue our work with the COVAX facility in making sure everyone has access to vaccines, especially vulnerable populations in low and middle income countries. And the second big priority for this year is education. We want to reimagine education for the future, build back better, make sure every school is connected to the internet. So all of these are massive priorities that will go with us in the next 4 years as we embark on a new strategic plan for UNICEF.
So education and vaccine rollout, the two kind of pillars of what the remainder of 2021 will be regarding your goals. Now, what can we do to help at Gamers Without Borders?
Help us message, relay our messages. You are influencers. You're the young people, you're the generation of the future. So one thing is you're participating in these tournaments and the games. This is great. You can use this as a very powerful platform to relay our messages. It's not just giving us support in terms of funds and influence. I always think of income and influence. If you can help UNICEF by increasing our income so we can disperse it fast where the needs are the most pressing in vulnerable populations and children, and at the same time help us message properly. If you go to our website, you'll see there's a parental portal. You have a lot of information on vaccine hesitancy and miscommunication around vaccine and how we can fight that. So you can help us in that sense. Your voice matters. We know today the big priorities in the world are mental health, education, climate change. You are the ones who can help put pressure directly or indirectly on multiple stakeholders across private sector and public sector to make things better for the future generation. And we need to build back greener and better. And your voice matters.
Spread the word on social media and make your voice heard. I love that. I mean, Carla, thank you so much for joining me on Gamers Without Borders. It really has been a pleasure having you, and best of luck with the remainder of 2021 with UNICEF.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.